since these two numbers added together must remain 300. But we want to know what happens after a long time, so we got to keep going. After another hour, we write the same percentages, except now the number of humans is 135 instead of 150, and for the zombies we got 165 instead of 150. This outputs 125 for the humans and 175 for the zombies. So we seem to keep losing humans, but will this continue? Well, what we have here is some linear equations that can be represented as a matrix of those percentages which don't change. This is multiplied by the inputs h and z, or the current population of humans and zombies at any time, and all of this equals the populations after that given hour. This is called a Markov matrix, by the way, since its columns sum to 1 and it has no negative values. But this is like what we just saw. The matrix we have is going to do stuff to, or scale and rotate, the input vector. The first input was 150, 150, the initial human and zombie populations. And after 1 hour, or multiplication, it gets moved to 135, 165. But we have to keep going and apply another transformation, sending it to 125, 175, the populations we found after 2 hours. So as we keep applying these multiplications, the real question is, where does this vector go? Well, let me put a few vectors on the graph to show this, each representing populations which add to 300. If we do the matrix multiplication and look at the transformations, you'll notice this vector, or anything on this line, stays put, while everything else moves towards it. That vector is an eigenvector of our matrix. The associated eigenvalue is 1 since it doesn't scale. And since that vector doesn't rotate or scale, it's the equilibrium of the system and therefore the answer to our question. After a long time, populations will settle to numbers which lie on this line and add to 300, which would be 100 for the humans and 200 for the zombies. Any other population values will just move a little closer to these after each hour. If you put those values inside the equations from before, you'll see the output remains 100 and 200 for the humans and zombies respectively. Then if the percentages were to change, the question just comes down to what is the eigenvector of the new matrix? There may not be a zombie infestation anytime soon, but this kind of math could be used to analyze how a virus will spread throughout a population, for example. And one of my favorite applications of this is the Google PageRank algorithm, which involves Markov matrices and ranks websites by treating outgoing links as probabilities of transitioning from one site to another. For more on that, I have a dedicated video which I'll link below. Here's a happy story, not at all. On April 29th, 1992, a man named Reginald Denny was beaten nearly to death live on national TV, and this was just a completely innocent man who had done nothing wrong. You can see Reginald laying here, probably unconscious, after the attack. The attack itself can be seen here on YouTube, but in an attempt to not get age restricted like that video is, I'm only showing the portion right after. Now the backstory here is that April 29th, 92 was the first day of the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. Reginald Denny was a truck driver whose route for the day involved going through an area where rioting was taking place, which he was not informed about. When he got there, he was stopped by rioters, dragged out of his truck, and that's when the beating took place. Now, identifying who assaulted Denny was not easy since the quality of the live footage wasn't amazing. But what helped law enforcement confidently identify one of the attackers was some advanced math. To understand how this was accomplished, we need to first look at what a digital image is.
Вот автомобиль Audi Q7, сейчас он на торгах стоит 540 тысяч рублей и может упасть.
A digital image, when you look real closely, is just made up of a bunch of pixels, each of a single color. Those colors can then be represented by some numerical value. Which means like a square picture made up of 1,000,000 pixels, 1,000 along each edge, could be represented by a 1,000 by 1,000 matrix, where the entries are the color values of each pixel. Working with black and white pictures is much easier though, because a black pixel can be represented with a 0, and a white can be a 1, let's say. We'll actually work with grayscale images here though, meaning anything in between 0 and 1 can exist, which will correspond to a different shade of gray. So when it comes to image processing and manipulation, whether it be blurring an image, detecting edges, sharpening an image, and so on, It all comes down to manipulating the pixels in a very specific way. To see an example, let's mathematically blur this image of the number 1. To do so, I'm going to make a 3x3 matrix where every entry is 1/9. This is known as a kernel in image processing, by the way. Then what we're going to do is lay this kernel over our image matrix and multiply the individual entries in each square together, then add the results. In this case, it's just 1 times 1/9 9 times, so the sum of all those is 1. Yes, this kernel is really just finding the average of the pixels inside it. From there, we're going to take that sum of 1 and set the center pixel to that color in the new image. It just so happened not to change. It's still 1 or white, but that won't always be the case. Now, you'll notice this grid on the right, where the blurred image will go, is the same size as the one on the left. To get the entire blurred image, we're just going to sweep that red section across the original one. When we slide it over once, all those pixels are still 1, so the average is also 1, and that's what this new pixel becomes. But after sliding over again, the kernel contains a black pixel, so we find the average of 8 1s and a 0, which is about 0.89. This corresponds to a very light shade of gray, which we will put in that middle square. After sweeping across the image, mapping each new number to the blurred image, these will be the values. I know this method doesn't really account for the border, but for our purposes, we're just going to keep that white. Now I'll actually color in the pixels based on their values, and we get a blurred image of the number 1. Actually, this is extremely blurred, almost beyond recognition. If we put an outline along the colored region, we can see the 1 is still kind of there. The reason this is so blurred is because we're only working with 100 pixels. But what the kernel did was kind of took this sharp edge in the original image between black and white and smoothed or averaged it so we get this fading from dark to light in the blurred image. The kernel we use represents a type of blur known as a box blur, and from Wikipedia, if you input a picture with many more pixels, then apply the blur, this is the output you get. But there are several other kernels that will all accomplish different things. A Gaussian blur also, of course, blurs the image, but it assigns more weight to the middle square, so dark pixels stay fairly dark and vice versa. There's a sharpen kernel, and there's edge detection kernels which search for sharp changes in color. You'll notice that all the numbers in this kernel sum to 0, so if we put it over a section of an image where all colors are roughly the same by these numbers, then adding the results would just yield 0 or a black pixel, which is why that corresponding area is black. The only sections that aren't are where we find sharp changes in color, aka an edge. As another example of edge detection, here's a poorly taken photograph of someone's arm, and by using edge detection algorithms, researchers were able to identify a region of some kind of birthmark or tattoo. Well, this is actually a zoomed in portion of this image, where those men can be seen beating Reginald Denny. Using image processing techniques similar to what we've seen, one company was able to determine that this mark was a rose tattoo affiliated with a certain gang in Los Angeles, and it was this that helped them eventually secure a conviction of one of the perpetrators of the attack. Now, all of this may not have involved much matrix math like we saw earlier, but note I did simplify some things to avoid going into too much detail. And not only image processing, but computer graphics heavily use matrices. With these, what we can do is take geometric data and incorporate it into a coordinate system. We can then scale, rotate, reflect, shift images, and more through matrix manipulation. But things do get much more complicated. Like when you want to project a 3D image into a 2D plane, you can use matrix math to map the 3D points and find where they would appear on the flat screen. Not going to go into much more detail than that, but again, computer graphics are another very useful application of matrices. But for those wanting some real tangible results that come from matrix math, let's look at networks and graph theory. Graphs can represent a lot of things: people and who they're friends with, connections on a dating app, networks of cities and how they're connected, websites and how they link to each other, and so on. With small networks, it can be easy to intuitively understand what's going on. Like if I said here's a group of co-workers and connections represent mutual friendships, it wouldn't be hard to see like this is the most popular person and this is the least popular with only one friend. If you had to find how many mutual friends these two people have, no big deal. You can just count and see that it's 3. But when the networks get more complex, we need mathematical tools to help us identify key things. This could be like which website should be ranked the highest on the web, which I mentioned earlier. It could be finding who's more likely to spread a disease in a college full of students, or which people involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks were most critical to the operation and should be prioritized by law enforcement. Yes, they actually did this after 9/11, which I have discussed in a previous video. We need some techniques in these cases so we can find things that our eyes aren't always able to when the connections get this chaotic. But let's see what matrices can reveal when it comes to dating apps. Imagine this app only has 3 men signed up that will label 1 through 3, and 3 women labeled 4 through 6, and they're matched together as shown. These are mutual connections, by the way, like both people swiping right, and you'll note for now that there are no same-sex matches. We see this first guy is matched with all 3 women, the second guy with 2, and the third with 1. Now this graph provides a nice visual for this situation. But what we can also do is make a table of 6 rows and 6 columns for the 6 people and analyze this instead. We'll say if 2 people are matched, like person 1 and person 4 are, then in the square located in column 1 and row 4, we will put a 1. However, since these are mutual connections, we need to also include a 1 in column 4 and row 1. Basically, if 1 matches with 4, then of course 4 has matched with 1, so the data has to reflect that. So that means, yes, the table is going to be symmetric about the diagonal. Then if 2 people are not connected, like person 1 and 2, we'll put a 0 in that square, in this case column 1 and row 2, but of course we can't forget column 2 and row 1. Since no one matches with themselves, the diagonal is going to be all zeros, and then these would be the rest of the connections. So if you want to know whether person 5 and 2 are connected by the table, just go to column 5 and row 2, or vice versa, and see if there's a 1 or a 0 there. From this, there are obvious things we can see. Like for person 1, we can look down their column or across their row and find they have 3 matches in total because of the 3 ones. But we're going to use some slightly more advanced math to analyze this graph. So instead of considering this a table, we're going to call it a matrix by just taking away the grid lines, but otherwise nothing has changed. When it comes to graphs, this is known as an adjacency matrix. Another way to interpret this, though, is that it tells us how many paths of length 1 exist between any 2 nodes. Oh, and for the rest of this video, when I say path, I just mean any sequence of edges that joins a sequence of vertices, basically just a walk. Those who know graph theory may not like this because a path is usually more specific, but I am being generic here. Okay, so what's this really mean? We'll look at column 6 and row 1. We know this says that those 2 people are matched, no big deal. But it also means there is one path of length 1 that exists between them. Those are saying the same thing. If we put a dot at person 1 and can only traverse one edge, well, there's one way to get to person 6. That's what this 1 represents. On the other, there are 0 ways to get from person 1 to person 2 in one edge. If you start at person 1, there are paths to person 2, but they all have a length of 2, which is not what we were looking for. But now, what if I want to see quickly how many mutual matches 2 people have? Well, if we look at person 1 and 2, this isn't tough. We see there are 2 mutual matches. However, this question of mutual matches is no different than asking how many paths of length 2 exist between person 1 and person 2. Well, we just saw that. The answer is 2, as expected, since it's the same question. Again, if I start at 1, I can go to 4 then 2, or 5 then 2. Those 2 paths mean 2 mutual connections. The cool thing, though, is that we can find how many of these paths of length 2 exist between any 2 nodes by just multiplying the adjacency matrix by itself, or squaring it. We see for person 1 and 2 there are 2 mutual connections, so that checks out. Then if you look at the graph for person 2 and 3, they have no mutual connections. And on the matrix, this checks out as well from column 3 and row 2 having a 0. However, person 1 and 3 are both connected to 6 and no one else, which we can also find in the matrix, and you get the idea. But now, what would the diagonal mean? Well, that's how many paths of length 2 exist between a person itself, aka how many matches they have. Think about it. For person 1, if I start there, to get back to 1 in 2 edges, I can go to 4 then 1, 5 then 1, or 6 then 1. 3 options for the 3 connections. This is why we see a 3 there in the matrix. Person 2 then has 2 matches, and it goes on. Then if we multiply the new matrix by the original, the same as finding the original cubed, we get all the paths of length 3 from one person to another. See, the original matrix to some power tells us how many paths of that length exist between any 2 nodes. Now if we have a same-sex connection in link 1 to 2, let's say, all we have to do is add a 1 to the original matrix in the first column, second row, and vice versa. See, when implementing this into software, we just have to make small tweaks to the adjacency matrix, and from there squaring or cubing it tells us a lot. Actually, something I found interesting was what the matrix cube tells us, specifically the diagonal. For one, it tells us how many paths of length 3 exist between a person and themselves. But looking at the graph, a length 3 path back to yourself tells us there's a triangle there. I'm not going to explain this one in depth, but if you sum the numbers along the diagonal, also known as the trace of the matrix, and divide by 6, that tells you how many triangles in total there are in the network. I just found that to be a cool thing the matrix tells us, which you wouldn't think about at first. Then on another topic, something I haven't even mentioned yet is machine learning and neural networks, which are coded with and manipulated by matrix math. Mathematically, matrices are a huge aspect of what allows the machine to, quote, learn. Or in terms of security, there's an example of an older kind of encryption method, which is the Hill cipher. This cipher incorporates matrix operations in order to encrypt and decrypt messages, although no, it's not a modern encryption method. And as much as I'd love to keep going into depth on different subjects, this video is already quite long, so hopefully this showed just how powerful and matrices are. But regarding encryption and security, I do want to thank Dashlane for sponsoring this video, a company that's dedicated to keeping you safe and secure on the internet. Dashlane is a password manager that, well, does several things. One, it'll safely store all your passwords all in one place and sync them between devices, so you never have to deal with resetting all those passwords you made months or years ago that you can't remember. With this, Dashlane will also autofill usernames and passwords for any site you have stored in their vault, making it just a little easier to navigate the internet. Something more important than remembering passwords, though, is having secure passwords and being safe from hackers, which Dashlane takes care of. We're told we shouldn't store the same password for different sites, since being hacked in one place makes you vulnerable elsewhere. And with Dashlane that is solved, as you have the option to have them auto-generate very secure passwords to be stored and used across all your devices. You will have one single master password that you create when you sign up for Dashlane, and that is used to encrypt all others. So even if someone were to gain access to internal servers, they would just see gibberish. You, on the other hand, can feel safe knowing you have different and very secure passwords for each site, yet all you have to do is remember one single password. Plus, for added security, they'll notify you if you're compromised to give you complete peace of mind as you browse the internet. Pricing is already really cheap, but if you sign up at the link below or go to dashlane.com/majorprep, you'll get 10% off your premium subscription. Plus, there's a 30-day free trial, so no risk in just giving it a try. Again, links are below, and with that, I'm going to end that video there. If you guys enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, hit the bell if you're not being notified, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Теряетесь в выборе банка? Заходите в финансовый супермаркет Банки.ру. Кредиты, вклады, ипотека. Вам подберут самые выгодные предложения. Нужно лишь заполнить анкету. Финансовый супермаркет Банки.ру. Деньги находятся здесь. Одобрено.